The 1960s was a decade of transformation. Because of the leadership of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and the efforts of so many who believed in his dream and that change would come, the civil rights movement sparked legal, cultural, and moral shifts toward equality that continue today. There are few people who can say they were at some of the most historic marches and speeches of that time. Reverend Dr. Harold Middlebrook is one of those rare individuals.
I grew up in a house where, in Memphis, where my grandmother and grandfather, my mother-in-law, read the paper every day. They checked out the news. And so as a youngster, I kept up with the events of Emmett Till and his killing in Mississippi, the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. And I was exposed early to people in our community who were leaders of the community, with the Urban League, with the NAACP. So I grew up with discussion all around me about someday life was going to be better for our community.
Little did Dr. Middlebrook know that change would begin shortly after starting college at Morehouse. There he met Dr. King when he came to speak at the school on nonviolence.
And somebody in the crowd said to him, "Dr. King, it's good to talk it, but show us how it's done." And so Dr. King made a phone call home and went to sit in at Rich's department store. I was in the group, and we all got arrested together. We had this huge cell space where you had the bunk beds, and in the mornings you came out of there, and they closed those doors, and you sat in a huge room. So we had all day to listen to Martin Luther King Jr. teach about social justice, about nonviolence, about caring.
And so, Dr. Middlebrook began a friendship with Dr. King and traveled throughout the Southeast as an active participant in the civil rights movement. A movement that took him from Birmingham to Danville to Tuscaloosa and Selma, before ultimately returning to Memphis, where he supported the sanitation workers on strike and continued his work with Dr. King.
When you study Jesus, and you study Mahatma Gandhi, and you study Thoreau, there were always people who were committed to change, who were committed to making life better for numbers of people other than themselves. And there was always the challenge of knowing that death was near. But Martin King made a speech and said, "Any man who has not found a cause worth dying for has not found a reason to live."
Memphis would be Dr. King's final location as he, Dr. Middlebrook, Ralph Abernathy, Jesse Jackson, and many others gathered at the Lorraine Motel to prepare for a march on behalf of the sanitation workers on April 4th, 1968.
Dr. King loved catfish, and the owner of the motel, Miss Bailey, knew it. So she sent up a platter with catfish, fries, hush puppies. And Dr. Abernathy said, "Where's mine?" And Dr. King said, "Hush, Ralph. All of us can get something off of this plate." And he had all of us to take something off of that plate, as it was the Last Supper. Jesse Jackson hollered, "Look, Dr. King, look who's here." Dr. King looked at him and said, "Brother Ben, what you doing here?" And he said, "The whole band is here, Doc." He said, "We're gonna play at the mass meeting." And Dr. King said, "I want you to play Precious Lord, and play it real pretty." And he stood up, and we heard the bang, and the police ran inside asking where did that sound come from. The attorneys ran outside trying to see, but he was gone. And that king was laying there. Rev. Abernathy was holding him. They were communicating with their eyes that he could not speak. But we knew when he left that balcony that he was gone.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
To be able to see Dr. King and the work that he did, even as Dr. King was a young man, but those were formative years for my dad. He was a young adult at that time, a college student. And so to be able to see that work firsthand, to learn from him, to understand his heart and his passion and his teachings, I think left a really big imprint on him. And to be there when his mentor and his friend lost his life, I can only imagine the hurt that he would have felt in that moment, but to know and understand that he took that love and that passion for community and for striving for change, that he used what he had learned as motivation to continue to make his community better. It's just so inspiring for me.
You don't have to be rich to be great. You could just be great. And these guys and gals, they didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a tremendous amount of influence, but what they did have, they gave, and they gave it in large measure. And so they modeled for us that possibility, that when you're on the right side of history and when you're on God's side, anything is possible.
I think one of the things that's important about a person like Reverend Middlebrook is he's constantly remind us that there's these larger concepts: justice, freedom, peace, equality. And he's reminding us that even as things change, there's more work to be done. And he's a leader in that work in this community.
I think what Dr. Middlebrook brings to the table is a legitimacy of being involved for a long period of time. I can think of a lot of people who have kind of burst onto the scene and for a while been really committed, but then they go away. There's something to be said for Dr. Middlebrook, who's been consistently committed to moving things in a better direction.
He has a way of turning you on when he preaches. I mean, he gets fired up and you get fired up.
Wherever he goes to preach, normally his kids and his grandkids follow him. So, and which is a good thing. So he's even training up the grandkids to be in church.
My dad loves being a granddad. They love Granddaddy Rev. He really, really enjoys his great-grandchildren. So he has 4 great-grandchildren, 2 boys and 2 girls, and they are the light of his life.
You can't have a future without children and youth. And those lives have to be touched by God and Christ in order for their lives to mature and grow up and be leaders.
If you ever hear him preach, make no doubt about it, he's one of America's greatest preachers. But then he'll leave the pulpit and then he will help to create something like Emerald Youth.
So Emerald Youth exists to rise up a large number of godly young people who are helping to renew their communities. We are developing programs in 3 areas: faith, learning, and health, with the hope of being able to serve youth and their families holistically and contributing to positive outcomes for young people in the communities where we serve. He's a giant in the city, not just a spiritual leader or a political leader, but as one who for the last 60, 70 years has walked fully in a God-given mandate to inspire people to help find their place in community.
Reverend Middlebrook is one of those kind, when young people see him, they just get excited, right? So he's clearly left an impact and an impression because he's sort of larger than life. So when you see him, particularly our young kids, it's almost like they're seeing a legend. I know that when he walks in, they feel his presence, and it's inspiring to them.
I came to Knoxville to take over the editorship of the New Sentinel, and I met Harold Middlebrook shortly after I arrived here, and somehow we just clicked. I've always admired him as a friend, as a leader, and his involvement in the community.
First time I met Dr. Middlebrook, I must have been about 15 years old. And every time I've ever been in his presence, I always felt liked. And that does something for a young person. And I remember just stepping into his presence. I was unemployed, I didn't have kind of a map for what my future would be, but I knew there would be a future. And it was so affirming to a young guy trying to press the reset button, to have someone of his stature look at you and say, "You're gonna be all right."
I think that my dad would want his legacy to be a legacy of service, because that's what he has tried to do. His entire life has been about serving.
What would another Harold Middlebrook be worth to our world and our community? It's priceless.
Whatever you have been called to do, it is your assignment to do it and do it well, and do not stop. So I think Dr. Middlebrook figured that out, what that call was, and he's doing it and doing it well. Likewise, we should do the same.
If I can help somebody as I pass along, then my living shall not be in vain. If I can cheer somebody with a word or a song, if I can show somebody that he's traveling wrong, then my living shall not have been in vain. When I'm gone, all I want them to say is, he tried to help somebody. He tried to do the best he could to lift others, because in lifting others, my own spirit is lifted, and we can survive.